So I recently put up this paneling in my son's room, and this is the first time that I've ever attempted paneling, and I was amazed with how easy it was to do, how affordable it was, and how much it totally transformed his room. Now guys, if this is something that I can do, then you can totally do this. So I want to walk you through the steps that I took, as well as the things that I learned from and will not repeat, so that you guys can put some paneling up in your house and have a success. So when my kids shared a room, they had bunk beds. But my son decided he did not want them anymore, so I'm just taking them apart and he will have just one bed in his room now. This will be a lot easier for me to make, so I am all for this. Now to start off this project, I had to remove this bottom piece of trim. Now to do this, I first start off with an X-Acto knife, cutting that caulking line. This will just release it from the wall so I can get it off a little easier. Now I'm just using a butter knife to get back in here and get the pry bar in. Another thing to make sure that you do is use a board to back against when prying. I've learned this the hard way, and if you don't do this, then you end up leaving marks in your drywall that you just have to go back and fix later. So I went through and I pre-marked all the studs on the wall, because as much as possible I want to make sure to nail into the studs just for a more solid hold. Now I'll be using melamine here on the walls. My walls have a texture on them, and so I wanted the bottom part of the board and batten to have just a smooth look. So this is what I will be using. If you already have a smooth wall or you don't mind the texture look on your wall, then you don't need to use this. So there were a couple routes I could have gone with the paneling. I could have bought 4 sheets and ran it from the floor to the ceiling. However, I didn't quite want to spend that much, so I ended up buying 2 sheets. And since I wanted my paneling to run over halfway up the wall, I ended up just cutting off some strips that were extra on the edges here. And I'll be using these to back against the trim boards on the bottom and the top, just to give me a little extra height to the batten board. Now, since I'll be pushing out the one trim board a 1/4 inch, I need to come along and cut the boards that match up to it, just to allow room for that. Now I'm using an inexpensive tool that you've probably seen me use before. It's just from Harbor Freight and it works great. Now I apologize that I didn't show myself putting in those 1/4 inch boards that I cut behind this piece of trim, but I promise you they're there. And now I'm just nailing into the studs in the wall, pushing that trim back in place and making sure that it's level. Sometimes it can be hard to tell what's level when you have things against carpet. And now I just measured and marked where that outlet box was, and I'm cutting it into the panel here. And this tool works great for something like this. So this board will go under that bottom piece of trim about a 1/4 inch, just enough so that there is not a gap. And it lines up perfect. Loving that. Now I wanted to point out, I found these at the hardware store, and it's to bring the outlet out to match up with the new paneling. So there are these pieces that just clip together. So you can just fold them over and clip them together, and you can clip as many as you need together to get the height that you need. Then there's a hole right there in the middle where you would put your screw and screw in the outlet into place. Then I'm just making sure I got the board level, and I'm just going to nail it in place into the studs in the wall. Now for a more solid hold, you could use adhesive. However, I'm not sure that I'm going to want this paneling up forever, so I didn't want to do something quite as permanent. If I tried to remove this board and it had adhesive on it, it would really destroy the drywall behind it, and I would have a lot bigger project on my hands later. And now I'm moving to the vertical boards. My wall is 148 inches wide, so mine are roughly 16.5 inches apart. Now I'm using 1x2 common board here, but I will talk about this a little later on and point out why I would not use common board again on a project like this. Now I will be using adhesive for these boards since it will be against the melamine. I'm using a spacer to make sure that I have the spacing correct and a level to make sure that they're straight up and down. Now you can see I cut my paneling just right so that my vertical boards will cover up where my two pieces of melamine meet. I'm going along with just a small bit of caulking, just enough to make sure that there's no seams here. I want this to look like one solid piece. I also went through with wood filler and made sure to patch any of the nail holes, just getting it all primed for painting. Now while that was drying, I went out into the garage and I just stained the top trim pieces. I'm staining with Minwax Provincial, and I really like how it makes the wood pop but still has a dark, rich color. I do like using the common board here because I feel like seeing the imperfections really adds to the look. And removing the outlet cover here so that I can paint. And just going along, taping everything up for the painting. Now taping up the bottom was a little tricky here. I wanted to make sure that no paint got underneath. So what I did is I took the tape and I just pushed it slightly underneath that bottom trim board, just so that the tape could protect even underneath that board, providing just a little extra coverage over the carpet. Then I went along with some brown paper and I taped it on just to make sure it would catch anything that might drip. Now I used a brush and a roller for the painting here. Using a roller whenever possible, but a lot of areas I needed a brush. And you'll see when I go along to that bottom trim piece, one more measure for making sure I did not get paint on the carpet was I used a metal strip to just kind of slide under there and make sure that I was not letting the paint go too far down or pool up at the bottom. I ended up using the color Peppercorn by Sherwin Williams, and I'm really happy with the color. It has slight blues in it, which I really like and wanted, but it has a nice classic gray look to it and will go with a lot of things in my son's room. All right, you can just see, look how that tape comes right off and there is no paint on my carpet. At this point, I went and did 2 coats of the pure white paint on the top, just because I knew that once the paneling was up on the top, it was going to be a little tricky to paint, especially up there where it matches up to the ceiling. Just like the bottom, I'm using strips of that melamine just to put in behind the trim board so that they will sit out and be flush with the other boards. Now I'm using screws and I'm just screwing this into the studs in the wall. And you'll notice I'm trying a few tricks because the problem that I'm having is that the screw is not recessing into the melamine. So you can see that that screw head is just sitting out there. And when I put the board here, it rocks back and forth because the screw head is sticking out. And if I were to put that trim board on now, it would not sit right. So my fix to this was to grab a drill bit and just drill out enough so that the screw head was recessed enough so that the board on the outside would sit flush against it. And here I am just putting on some adhesive on my trim board so that it will have a nice hold against the melamine. Now, if you like this video, please make sure to subscribe because I have a lot of fun builds coming up that I really want to share with you guys. So I just push that trim piece up against the wall, and then using my stud finder, I find the studs along the wall and put some nails in there just to hold it in snug. And you could probably see that I have a 45 cut in the board here. That's just so that when I put up this second board, they will line up correct and you won't see any imperfections. Now here's the issue with using cheap boards. You can see that knot right there, there's even a hole in it, and you can see that grain pattern. Now since it's a dark color, this really won't matter on the bottom. But if it were white, you would see it so much more. So I went back to the hardware store and bought these premium pieces of wood. They come primed, and as you can tell, there is just no imperfections with them. So this is what I'll be using for the top. If I had to do this over again, I would have used these boards on the bottom as well. And now moving to the vertical pieces on the top. I just leave that top trim board sitting there just to use as a reference. And I'm just lining up those vertical boards with the bottom boards so that they will look uniform. And then I just use that level just to make sure that they're straight up and down and nail it to the wall. Now I'm moving on to the chevron boards. And the easiest way I found to do this was to use a spacer, and my spacer is 15 inches. So this just makes sure that these boards are going to have the right spacing from the bottom, from the ceiling, and from each other. Then I just line them up, and using my nail gun and the stud finder, I just put some nails into the studs in the wall to hold them in there tight. Now just for reference, my boards are 38 inches long with about a 25-degree cut on both ends. Now just like the bottom boards, I'm going along with caulking and wood filler just to make sure that I have what looks like one solid piece without any gaps in it. Now I'm just taping off all the edges and getting ready for painting. I did 2 coats of the pure white paint on this. On the end of my second coat, I went along with a roller and I just got all of the fronts of these boards, and that just gave it a real nice coat and got rid of any brush marks. So one thing that really makes a project look sloppy is a messy paint line on the edges. So I went back with just a small little art brush and I just touched up all of the edges, both along the bottom and along the top where the white is. I came along with the last trim board and nailed it into place. Now you can see I have this one cut at a 45 as well. Again, just so that you will not see imperfections if the boards don't line up exactly. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I was amazed with how easy it was to do and how much money that I could save on doing it myself. This would easily be over $1,000 to pay to have somebody do it. However, doing it myself cost a few hundred. So don't be afraid to get out there and try a few things on your own. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.